Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I'm Ben DeBono here to talk to you about Book 5 of Milton's Paradise Lost. Nearly at the halfway point, everyone. You know, Book 5, I want to make the argument, well, at least suggest the possibility, because like I've talked about, I'm not enough of an authority on Milton or literature in general to claim any point definitively or feel comfortable doing so. But I want to make the suggestion that even though in Book 5 we don't see Adam and Eve's fall, and we don't necessarily even see Satan's fall, even though we flash back and we see things progressing along those lines, possibly even getting to the point of no return for Satan and the other angels and their inevitable war in heaven. I think even though we don't see those horrible moments that the whole poem is leading up to, this is arguably the most tragic book in Paradise Lost. Why? Because essentially what's going on in this book is 3 different warnings. 2 of them directed at Adam and Eve, 1 of them in the flashback directed at Satan and the other angels, all of them saying, turn back. The direction you are going in is going to destroy you. And in each of those cases, we as the readers of this poem are aware that each of those warnings is going to be ignored, ultimately. And what makes this book so tragic is that I would argue that by the time we actually reach the moment of the fall for Adam and Eve, and by the time we reach the point where Satan and his angels are at war with Michael, which will happen in the next couple books, that the situation is already irretrievable. Things have already gone to the point where the fall is going to happen. Whereas at this point where the warnings are taking place, there is still that moment where Adam and Eve can turn back. There is still that moment where Satan can turn back, his angels can turn back, and none of them ultimately do so, making this book, the book of unheeded warnings, arguably the most tragic in all of Milton. So we're going to get into that. It's also worth noting, I mentioned last time that Milton kind of does this thing where I use the example of how in Book 3 God says there's no opportunity for repentance for Satan and the fallen angels. And then in Book 4 we get this soliloquy from Satan where he's pondering what would happen if I did repent, and ultimately rejects repentance. So we kind of saw that on the one hand repentance is closed off, and even if it wasn't, it wouldn't make a difference. The same sort of dynamic is going on here in Book 5. So if you remember, Book 4 started with the apocalyptic invocation by Milton, and him saying, oh, if only there had been a warning, if only God had sent a warning for Adam and Eve. And then here, Milton is saying, even if that warning had taken place, it wouldn't have made a difference. So it's a very similar dynamic to what we saw between Books 3 and 4 with the redemption of Satan, and now Books 4 and 5 with the warning against the fall. In both cases, it really doesn't matter. And that's where a lot of the tragedy of the poem comes in. Okay, so a couple of introduction points just right off the bat. More minor things I wanted to point out. Again, keeping up with our ongoing dialogue of the parallels between Homer and Milton, it's worth noting that the first 2 lines of this poem, of this book, where Milton says, nor morn her rosy steps in the eastern clime, advancing sowed the earth with orient pearl. The whole concept of referring to morning with rosy steps is straight out of Homer. So Homer has this ongoing kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a euphemism, it's not really a euphemism, but this whole repeating phrase of Dawn's rosy fingers rising, or Dawn stretched out her rosy fingers. And, you know, he repeats that phrase over and over again in the Iliad. And maybe in the Odyssey, I'm not 100% sure on that, but for sure in the Iliad. So Milton's just echoing him there. And then it's also interesting to note that, and I won't really get into the quotes extensively here because we'll have quite a bit to read later on. I want to save the readings more for when we get into some of the great warning scenes that take place in this book. But it's interesting to note that we had the question last time of Satan sitting there watching Adam and Eve and contemplating the prohibition of the tree of knowledge. And essentially, he has that line where he says, isn't there ignorance by which they stand? And I mentioned that that's a very fascinating question to ponder. And I think that at least for Milton, we get something of an answer in this book because Adam and Eve may not have the knowledge that the tree of knowledge of good and evil would bring, but they're not stupid either. Adam makes this whole speech to Eve before he wakes her up here at the beginning of Book 5, where he's talking about, he's just describing the fields and the bees are pollinating the flowers. So he has this expansive knowledge of nature and everything. And then later on when Raphael comes down, from heaven, we'll see this kind of exchange where Adam shows him a sort of formalized courtesy. So he's not a child. And C.S. Lewis in Preface to Paradise Lost, which I just finished reading a couple days ago, wonderful book, by the way. If you want to supplement this with far better material than what I've got for you, go read C.S. Lewis. But he points out that the way Adam and Eve address each other before the fall is very formal. They'll use titles for her. So, for example, here Adam says, "My fairest, my espoused, my latest found, heaven's last best gift, my ever new delight." And then he begins telling her, time to get up. But it's this very formalized sense of courtesy and regality that exists with Adam and Eve here before the fall. And so we're not dealing with an ignorant person. Now, on the contrary to that, of course, we have Eve's narcissist event where she's staring into a pool. It's like, who's that? Oh, it's me. And she certainly comes across as naive there. But I think you could maybe say that that's more of a thematic moment than it is trying to establish their pre-fallen nature, right? It's more, again, a foreshadowing of the pride that is going to bring Eve down, that parallels Satan's own pride, more than, oh, what a foolish child pre-fallen Eve is. One last thing on this topic is that I think it's also interesting to note the full range of emotions that Adam and Eve display in their pre-fallen state in Milton. Later on in this book, he'll mention one of them crying, and then there's the fear and confusion Eve experiences after her dream, and there's this whole gamut of emotions. And so these are not simplistic characters. And I think that's important to Milton's theology here, that he doesn't want us to just kind of see that Adam and Eve are these two doofuses wandering around and then, oops, they accidentally got some knowledge. I mean, whatever his view of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and hopefully we'll get some more of that in the later books, but whatever his view of it, it isn't that Adam and Eve are idiots before and now they're smart fallen creatures. It's that, no, there's more complexity both before and after than that very simplistic view of the story would have us believe. Okay, so three warnings in this book. And the first one we get right off the bat. Eve has this whole premonition. She has this dream. So Adam wakes her up, hey, we gotta get to work, and she says, well, I had this dream last night. And this is important because this is, again, another call out to epic poetry. The whole concept of premonition, of prophecies, is important to the epic genre. Read the Iliad, read the Odyssey, read the Aeneid. You're going to find all of those are just filled with prophecy, prophecy, prophecy the whole way through, and both heated and unheated, as far as what is going to take place later on in the story. So prophecy, very important to the epic genre and important here, especially within the thematic structure of Book 5. So I'm going to read here a substantial portion of Eve's vision because I think it's Very stunning and powerful imagery that we get here. Very unsettling, if we actually think of it, but also very, very visual the way that it invokes the mind. So I'll read extensively, and we'll either pause along the way if there's something that catches my eye that we need to discuss, or I'll throw out some thoughts here at the end of this quote. So, beginning in line 50, this is Eve speaking. Alone I passed through ways that brought me on a sudden to the tree of interdicted knowledge. Fair it seemed, much fairer to my fancy than by day. So already there, we have our first sense of warning, first little bit of temptation. And as I was wandering, looked, beside it stood one shaped and winged like one of those from heaven. This is Satan, of course. By us oft seen, his dewy locks distilled ambrosia. On that tree he also gazed. And, O fair plant, said he, with fruit surcharged, deigns none to ease thy load and taste thy sweet. Nor God nor man. Is knowledge so despised? So, let me stop there a little bit. So that echoes again Satan's whole observation of Adam and Eve at the end of book 4. But then we also are seeing, again, this whole parallel between humanity's fall and Satan's. Eve and Satan both gazing at the object of the fall. Now, of course, in Satan's case, the object of the fall isn't eating of the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but it is pride. And so pride drawing them both to this forbidden fruit. Okay. Or envy, or what reserve forbids to taste? Forbid who will, none shall from me withhold longer thy offered good. Why else set it here? This said he, pause not, but with venturous arm he plucked, he tasted. Me damp horror chilled at such bold words, vouched with a deed so bold. So now Satan has eaten from the tree. So again, in this vision, he falls first. But he thus overjoyed, O fruit divine, sweet of thyself, but much more sweet thus cropped, forbidden here, it seems, as only fit for gods, yet able to make gods of men. And why not gods of men, since good, the more communicated, more abundant grows? Right, so the argument here, well, if this makes you like God, why is that a bad thing? God's good. If you're more like God, you're more good, okay? More good. Better. You're better. Well, I suppose more good, because Satan here is talking about good as a quantifiable element. So, you have more goodness in you if you eat this. The author not impaired, but honored more. Here, happy creature, fair angelic Eve, partake thou also, happy though thou art, happier thou mayest be, worthier canst not be. Now, one thing I just want to point out that I noticed reading this here is I just mentioned the formal way Adam talks to Eve. Note that Satan seems to be doing something very similar. Here, happy creature, fair angelic Eve. It's very formal, with formalized titles in the same way that Adam uses to address Eve. So in a sense, and this thought's just coming to me as I read this, so please don't read too much into this, but in a sense you could almost say Satan steps into the role that Adam should be possessing here. Adam is not at the tree, he is absent, and so Satan takes his place. Make of that what you will. To me, I would have to think about it some more, but on first glance it seems compelling. Alright, so happier thou mayest be, worthier canst not be. Taste this and be henceforth among the gods, thyself a goddess, not to earth confined, but sometimes in the air, as we sometimes ascend to heaven. By merit thine, and see what life the gods live there. And gods, plural, of course, would include the angels at this point, in case that's confusing. And such live thou. So saying, he drew nigh, and to me held, even to my mouth, of that same fruit, held part which he had plucked. The pleasant savory smell so quickened appetite that I, methought, could not but taste. Forthwith up to the clouds with him I flew, and underneath beheld the earth outstretched immense, a prospect wide and various, wondering at my flight, and changed to this high exaltation. Suddenly my guide was gone, and I, methought, sunk down and fell asleep, but oh how glad I waked to find this but a dream. I mean, I don't know about you, and maybe it takes a couple readings. Maybe it's difficult hearing it out loud. to process everything that's going on there. But the imagery there is just so stunning, you know, from that initial moment of seeing the tree and then seeing Satan next to the tree, and then the attractiveness of it, and then they eat, and then, you know, the ascension to heaven, or almost to heaven, and it's this glorious, godlike moment of Eve and Satan together, having eaten from the tree, ascended into heaven, and then he vanishes, and she is on her own. And the imagery and the symbolism there just gives you chills. I mean, it is a stunning piece of writing by Milton. So many things going on here. We have Satan's own fall, you know, Eve's thought process from initial temptation that the tree looks attractive to ultimately eating of it and ultimately being abandoned. You know, that initial elation followed by abandonment and probably death as well. I think you could say that that's possibly implied there. You know, she's way up high in the earth, and suddenly Satan's gone and she doesn't have any wings, so, you know, arguably down she's going to go. And then kind of the inevitability of the fall too, you know, that line in, it's line 83, I think, where she says, I methought could not but taste. I couldn't help myself. So there's inevitability there, but then it also goes to the dialogue that takes place between Adam, Eve, and God later in Genesis, where, you know, Adam passes the buck to Eve, Eve passes the buck to Satan, and Satan just gets a boot up the ass. Okay, so that's everything that's going on there in this initial vision. Well, not everything, but those are some of my thoughts that I had. Again, another passage like what I mentioned last week is Satan's soliloquy, where if that doesn't get you, you know, the visceralness of that vision, then I don't even know what to say. You know, it's I think that should stir something in you. And if it's not, maybe it's time to learn to really open yourself up to this type of language and type of writing more. And maybe that's a learned skill. You know, there's no shame in having to learn something like that. But I would challenge you, like I challenged last week, that, you know, if that doesn't get you, work on allowing it to, because it's very powerful and it's meant to stir something in you. And it's a masterpiece, so it ought to. Okay, so the second flashback then comes from Raphael. He comes down and visits. Now, if you're confused, if you are a Protestant and you are confused by the references to the Book of Tobias, as Milton says, that's actually a reference to the Book of Tobit, which is part of the Deuterocanonical Scriptures, which Catholics would consider to be part of the canon, Protestants would not. I don't really care for the purpose of this video where you land on that debate, but if you're curious what those references are, that's a reference to the Book of Tobit, and Raphael makes an appearance in that book. So that's why it gets brought up. Now this warning, the second warning, is really going to extend beyond this book, but I think that it's important to note its placement here. It's beginning here for the thematic purposes of what's going on in Book 5, that the whole reason this story is taking place is to wave the big red flag to Adam and Eve and say, watch out, there is an enemy loose and he's going to try to bring you guys down, and now let me tell you about him. And of course then we go into the flashback. Well, one more note though before we talk about the flashback. First, the notes on Milton's angels. We get this whole long section where Milton goes into the mechanics of how the angels are eating and everything. Very theological. If, you know, your eyes might have glazed over here a little bit, and that's okay. Part of what's going on here is an interaction with the Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas' view of angels, which is almost the polar opposite of what Milton is describing here. So Aquinas would say that the angels are purely spiritual beings, and Milton's not going to say that they're corporeal in the same way that humans are, but they do need sustenance, they do need to eat, it's a different type of food, and so there's that whole interaction is a lot of what's going on there. Lewis has some really good notes on that in preface to Paradise Lost. Just look up his chapter on the angels. It's Not super long, but it will give you some good information if you were looking to dive into that section a bit more. And then the other interesting thing here is that the way Milton explains their ability to eat human food is that there's a kind of reverse transubstantiation going on here. So transubstantiation, for those of us who are Catholic, essentially transubstantiation is Thomas Aquinas's attempt to explain how it is that in the Eucharist the elements remain physically bread and wine, but spiritually become for us the body and blood of Christ. So we Catholics would say that the Lord's Supper is not a symbol of the body and blood of Christ. It is the literal body and blood of Christ, but yet the physical elements do not turn into physical flesh and physical blood. Obviously very complicated. Again, like the whole issue of the deuterocanonical books, for the purpose of this video, it doesn't really matter where you land on that, but that's the whole terminology and concept that Milton's invoking to explain how the angels eat. He's just kind of putting it in the other direction. Which is a little ironic because, like I said, transubstantiation is very Thomistic in nature, and given that he's in a dialogue of trying to argue against Aquinas' view of angels, it's a little interesting that he kind of uses some of Aquinas' own ideas against him there, so to speak. So, be that as it may. All right, so we get into the flashback. Now, this is a big moment for the poem because, again, epic poetry, like we talked about in the first video, begins in medias res, in the middle of the action. And so now we are finally going back. Remember our very first scene, Satan and the angels falling from heaven. Now, what led up to that point? That's what we're going to get in the rest of Book 5 in the next couple books. I think through Book 7, though I'm not 100% sure how far it goes. So we'll find out. So we start with some more Trinitarian issues. Now this is, going back to what we talked about with Book 3, the whole, what exactly is the relationship between the Father and the Son? Well, things get a little more complicated here. And for a moment, it seems like Milton is going even farther into a Trinitarian heresy, and then he really backs off on that later. He contradicts himself fundamentally in this book. So I'll point that out as we go along, starting with the scene that really sets off Satan's rebellion, which is God announcing, here's the Son and he's the King. So God says, this is starting in line 603, "This day I have begot whom I declare my only Son, and on this holy hill him have anointed, whom ye now behold at my right hand. Your head I him appoint." Okay. So obviously this is going to serve to set off the action. Satan, I'm not too happy that the Son is now the king, and that leads to his rebellion. So this is plot-wise very important. But here's theologically the problem for this scene, is that the angels are already there when the Father begets the Son. If you just follow what is going on here, the angels are there, they've existed seemingly for some time, and the Father says, "This day I have begot whom I declare my only Son." And that also really, that raises some major questions as far as what exactly within the world of the poem is the difference between the Father and the Son. Because you could even break this down further and say that he's declaring him the Son. He declares him my only Son. He isn't his only Son. He's declared his only Son. Now, are we getting too nitty-gritty here with the language? Maybe. But we know that, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? When we know that Milton has Trinitarian issues. We broke that down in Book 3, and then last video for Book 5, I read from the email that Jordan had sent, where he pulled the quotes from Milton's book on Christian doctrine, and there was tons of Trinitarian issues in there, so we know that he's got issues, and this really seems to say it. Now, the interesting thing is that later on, Abdiel, when he is giving his warning to Satan and the fallen angels, backs off of that, and we will, it's in the middle of this whole long quote here I have. But essentially, so we'll get to it, but essentially Abdiel is going to say, oh, what right do you have to rebel against the Son because you were created through him? Which completely flips what we just saw in those lines. So right now, Milton is saying, the Son created today, declared the Son, and all the angels already there. Later on, Abdiel is going to say, no, the Son was first, and you and I and all the other angels were created through him, which is back on track with orthodoxy. So we'll see that in a moment. But, just to throw out here again, we might have another Trinitarian red flag. So, Satan becomes resentful of the Son's status, and he gathers all the angels to himself, and he does so with a little bit of, well, not all the angels. He gathers a handful of the angels to himself. Or I think a third. I think Milton goes with the number from Revelation that talks about a third of the stars falling from heaven. I believe that there's a line in this book about that. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure it's there. So a third of the angels gathered together Satan. And it's important to note that Satan's already engaging in deception here. Where he basically tells them, hey, let's all get together and talk about how we're going to greet the king. Let's talk about how we're going to receive the Son. So he kind of he gathers them under false pretenses. And then he goes a step further into idolatry, specifically idolatry of his own freedom and liberty. So starting in line 787, will ye submit your necks and choose to bend the supple knee? Ye will not, if I trust to know ye right. Or if ye know yourselves, natives and sons of heaven, possessed before by none, and if not equal all, yet free, equally free. For orders and decrees are not with liberty, but well consist. So there again, so we've already have deceit, we have idolatry, pride coming in, pride being the first one, of course, that he chafes at the whole announcement the Father makes about the Son. So Satan is already well on his way to a fall at this point. But I want to argue that within the world of the poem, not necessarily theologically, theologically, I know we might split hairs here and say, well, Satan's already fallen because he's already engaged in 3 separate sins. But within the world of the poem, I don't think he's fallen yet. And he is well on his way, but he is definitely not past the point of no return. And that's why I stress that, is because now we get our third warning in Book 5, and this is from Abdiel, whose name means servant of God. And he stands up and warns Satan and the other angels to back off. Don't do this. This is not going to go well for any of us if you go down this road. And he has a very, very powerful argument, and I want to read it in its entirety. So starting at line 809. This is Abdiel speaking. O argument blasphemous, false, and proud. So he gets it there. There's the 3: blasphemy, idolatry, false, deceit, and pride. Words with no ear ever to hear in heaven, expected least of all from thee, ingrate, in place thyself so high above thy peers. I love that, where he just, he's ready to throw down right now. It's like, you stupid bastard, Satan. He's going at it. Even though this is a warning, this is by far the harshest of the 3 warnings we've seen in this book. Canst thou with impious oblique condemn the just decree of God, pronounced and sworn, that to his only Son, by right endowed with regal scepter, every soul in heaven shall bend the knee, in that honour due confess him rightful King? Unjust, thou sayest, flatly unjust, to bind with laws the free, and equal over equals to let reign, one over all with unsucceeded power. Shalt thou give law to God? Shalt thou dispute with him the points of liberty? Who made thee what thou art, and formed the powers of heaven, such as he pleased, and circumscribed their being? Yet by experience taught we know how good, and of our good, and of our dignity, how provident he is, how far from thought to make us less, bent rather to exalt our happy state under one head, more near united. But to grant it thee unjust, that equal over equals monarch reign, thyself, though great and glorious, thus count thus thou count, or all angelic nature joined in one, equal to him begotten Son, by whom, as by his word, the mighty Father made all things. So this is the part I was talking about. So by whom, as by his word, the mighty Father made all things, even thee, and all the spirits of heaven, by him created in their bright degrees, crowned them with glory, and to their glory named thrones, dominations, princedoms, virtues, powers, essential powers, nor by his reign obscured, but more illustrious made, since he, the head, one of our number, thus reduced becomes. His laws our laws, all honored him done returns our own. Cease then this impious rage, and tempt not these, but hast to appease the incensed Father and the incensed Son, while pardon may be found and time be sought. Okay, so let's talk about the Trinitarian stuff first. Because on the one hand, I mean, this is where Milton's just going all over the place. So the part I kind of stopped at and said, this is what I was talking about, you know, this is right about line 835, 836. The begotten Son, by whom, as by his word, the mighty Father made all things, even thee, and all the spirits of heaven. Okay, so now that seems like we're back on the Orthodox train, right? You know, okay, all things were made by the Son. Good. But then, like, just a few lines later, you know, it's 841. So he says, thrones, dominions, princedoms, blah, 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 nor by, you know, by his reign obscured, but more illustrious made. In other words, all the other angels, Abdiel is saying, aren't obscured by the Son. They're made more illustrious because, this is the important part, since he, the head, meaning God, one of our number, since he the head, meaning the Son, one of our number thus reduced becomes. So what does that mean when he says, you know, that he the head, one of our number thus reduced becomes? Is he saying there, and I could be misunderstanding it, but this is the way I'm taking it, that to me sounds like the Son was one of the angels up until that moment earlier on in the poem. And that would be way back on the heresy train there. So Milton is all over the map. Even if, you know, even if I'm wrong about my reading there of the last part, and please correct me if you think I am. Like I've said before, I'm no master on all this stuff. I'm passionate about it, and I want to pay close attention to it, but there's things that I know I'll get wrong, and so please correct me if you think that's one of them, or if you see any others. I want us all to grow in our knowledge here by, you know, sharing stuff that you guys think as well. But even if we discount that, we still have the fundamental contradiction between the earlier statement and then the one made here by Abdiel, which really makes it unclear where is the Son's creation chronologically in relation to the angels. And are the angels, in fact, made through the Son, or are they made, were they made before the Son? You know, is the Son on a different level of the angels, even if in Milton's world he might not be God? Or is the Son one of the angels who is then raised to the level, not of God, but of between God and the angels? So Milton is confused, I think we could say, about the nature of the Trinity. But to get to the content of this, okay, so we have a very strong warning here from Abdiel, and of course it's ignored. And that is where this book then ends, with that tragic choice. The last moment to turn back is rejected, and war in heaven is about to break out. And that's where we will go in Book 6. So lots of great stuff in this one. I think we could spend any amount of time just going line by line through, you know, the scenes in heaven, or I think the part that got me the most was probably Eve's vision at the beginning. It's just stunningly powerful, horrifically beautiful, you might say. You know, I keep going back to that image of her staring at the tree and Satan there. And, I don't know, that image just really grabbed me when I was reading this the other day, and grabbed me when I was reading it here on the video tonight. But yeah, let me know how you guys are enjoying Paradise Lost, what scenes are sticking out to you. So much great stuff in this poem. You know, I wish we had time to do, well, I suppose we do have time, but I don't think anybody would listen to me going through the book line by line, nor do I have the knowledge to do it. But I'm enjoying what we are finding the time to do here with these brief, relatively speaking, overviews of Paradise Lost. I'll be back next week sometime with Book 6. Until then, I'm out of here. And, this is Sci-Fi Christian. I'm Bendy Bono, and I will talk to you guys later. Goodbye.